Kia ora koutou. Thanks very much for having me to speak at your meeting tonight, and apologies I couldn't make it in person. My name's Laura MacKay. I'm the Acting Executive Director of Lawyers for Climate Action. We're a non-profit that uses the law to accelerate climate action, and as you can imagine, we've been very closely monitoring the proposed LNG import facility. What I wanted to do tonight is talk you through some of the information we have so far and some of the information that we really need. I'll also explain what we know about the government's proposed legislative process for enabling the LNG import facility. So, starting with the information landscape, I would say one of the key issues that we've been seeing with the LNG import facility is the lack of transparency from the government. I think this is particularly true for affected communities like yourselves, because you certainly deserve to understand the process and what it means for you. There are two key ways that we've been getting information from the government about the facility. One's through proactive releases from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, who have been running the LNG procurement process, and those are openly available on MBIE's website. The second is through requests under the Official Information Act, which is essentially a piece of legislation that allows anyone to seek information from public bodies. What I wanted to do is highlight a few key documents for you today, which essentially raise the question of who's actually asking for the import facility and is it actually needed. It's obviously been justified on the basis of dry year risk insurance, but the information revealed and a lot of the advice that the government has received shows there's actually a low need for it. I've provided these documents to the organisers of this meeting so they can send them on to those who are interested in reading them. The first document I wanted to talk about is a report from Concept Consulting, which early government documents identified as the basis for their decision to proceed with the LNG import facility. The government commissioned Concept Consulting to model the impacts of an LNG import facility on New Zealand's energy prices in a range of scenarios. As a preliminary point, I wanted to note we had to go to some difficulty to get a hold of this document. It wasn't proactively released, and when it finally was, after a delayed response to an OIA request, there were substantial redactions in the document that we didn't think were justified. We're waiting for the outcome of an ombudsman investigation into this, but MB has lifted some of the redactions in response to our complaint. What we are able to see in the report is interesting. MB initially redacted a conclusion in the report that there is a low need for LNG, and in some scenarios there's actually no need for LNG at all. Part of the reason for this is that New Zealand's actually made quite good progress on building more renewable energy, which lowers the requirement for LNG to fill the energy gap, and that existing thermal options we have like coal are actually cheaper to run than LNG and would work as a transitional fuel. Key parts of this analysis are still redacted. We're hoping to have theirs released soon to understand what other points the independent consultants made. The second document I wanted to touch on is some advice from the Infrastructure Commission to MB, which we had released to us under the OIA as well. As a preliminary point again, what's immediately striking about this documentation is the lack of redactions, so it's really great transparency from the Infrastructure Commission as opposed to the documents we've been receiving from MB. The Infrastructure Commission made some really critical points. It was unconvinced by the need for the facility or even the problem that it aims to solve. It essentially said that MB needs to slow down and needs to make sure it's developing the right solution and not the most expedient one. It also made a really good point that given the cost and the potential long-term impacts of the LNG import facility, MB should have produced a business case that explores LNG and non-LNG options in depth, which it didn't do. Essentially, the government proceeded with one possible solution to dry year risk without properly assessing any others, including some options that wouldn't need new fossil fuel infrastructure or wouldn't contain the level of risk that the LNG import facility does. A combination of smaller scale alternatives that could succeed in delivering a similar level of system resilience with reduced risk and cost were also not assessed. Finally, the Infrastructure Commission noted it was unclear if the proposal will actually succeed in lowering energy prices like MB said it would. This is because of potential huge cost blowouts and the inherent volatility of LNG prices, which we've all seen after the war in Iran. I think it's important to say that these two documents are just examples, and you can take it within the context of comments from multiple different quarters advising the government that the LNG import facility is not the right approach. For example, there was a recent report from the OECD that said the proposal risks locking in fossil fuel dependence, and instead New Zealand should invest in other options like biomass or pumped hydro. And Meridian Energy, one of our large gentailers, has also made comments that New Zealand does not need to import LNG to cover electricity supply shortages. So the question then is, if the story trickling out through all of these documents is that the LNG import facility is not actually needed for dry year risk, who is benefiting, and does that benefit actually outweigh the risks to the New Plymouth community and to the environment? To properly understand that, we would need a lot more information that's not public yet, which is very frustrating. This would include things like a risk assessment, so providing information on the potential risks to the local community and the environment, things like exclusion zones, which would address the risk of an explosion, or the environmental risks like the impact on fisheries and nearby marine sanctuaries. We also need more information about how the facility will actually work. For example, is Port Taranaki big enough? Will there be enough firefighting capacity? Will there need to be dredging to accommodate the delivery boats? Will there need more tugs to pull in the LNG carriers? All of this information is still not available. We're hoping that it will be able to be accessed at some point in the future, and as soon as we can do so, we'll provide it on to the organisers of this meeting to share with you. The second point I wanted to touch tonight was on the enabling legislation. So the government is going to have to establish new legislation because essentially it thinks that our existing legislation for permits and consents, like the Fast Track Approvals Act or the Resource Management Act, is too slow to enable the LNG import facility. It's therefore essentially decided it will create bespoke legislation for the LNG import facility so that permits and consents will be granted quickly. The intention of the enabling legislation is also that it will clarify statutory responsibilities, set or modify statutory timeframes for decisions, and accommodate LNG as a new material in New Zealand. It may also enable the funding of the LNG import facility. This was initially part of the enabling legislation, but it's been a bit unclear since the government decided it would no longer fund the LNG import facility with a levy. We don't know a lot about the enabling legislation yet. We don't have a draft version of it. It hasn't been introduced to Parliament. But we do know that MB officials have set out essentially two different options for the minister to decide on. The first option, option A, is basically where the legislation would establish a statutory process for decision making on consents, permits, and conditions. This would be quite similar to the fast track process in which an independent panel is convened to make decisions on granting consents and permits. Alternatively, it could also empower the minister to make necessary decisions. Officials noted in their advice that because this legislation would be rushed to make it as fast as possible, there's a risk that the final project design wouldn't be fully reflected in this. In addition, they were less keen on this option because it has a higher risk of judicial review, and that's because it delegates decision-making power under the Act, and those decisions can then be judicially reviewed. Option B is where the primary legislation would just automatically grant as many consents and permits as possible within the legislation itself. This is more similar to emergency types of legislation like the Kaikoura earthquake response. Officials noted that this type of legislation is good for them because it has less options for judicial review. However, it's quite a large and complex bill to develop, and it would take a lot of time. Their recommendation was to go with option B because they think that because of the risks that they've identified with option A. It's not clear what the government decision is on this yet. It appears that the government may be intending to introduce the legislation after it signs a contract with the provider and probably after the election. This obviously creates some issues as the government would be locking New Zealand into a contract without a guaranteed ability to actually pass any of the consents or the permits. So while we don't have this legislation yet, there are a lot of concerns about how it will work. For example, how will it account for safety and environmental concerns? Will the public have a chance for input? Will the bill be pushed through under urgency? Again, we don't have the answer to any of these questions yet, but we'll be closely monitoring this and we'll notify the organisers when we do have more information about the bill.